A very warm welcome to you. We live in very turbulent times, as I think we all know all too well. The hopes of a few years ago that there was a sharp and steady decline in conflicts and the suffering associated with conflicts around the world seems to be less prominent now than it was even a few years ago. And all of us, I think, are trying to understand the causes of conflict, the grievances, the anger, the lacks of discipline, etc. In many, many meetings that we attend, you will hear that a conflict has nothing to do with religion. Even as we, I think, know quite well that it's complicated and that in many cases the religious dimensions are ones that need to be thoughtfully and carefully taken into account. And this is part of the mission of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and my job is simply to welcome you to the Berkley Center, as well as to the World Faiths Development Dialogue, which is based here. I'm Catherine Marshall, and I have the great privilege to be a friend and colleague of Joyce Dubensky, who is the leader on the event today. Joyce heads the Tanenbaum Center. I will not go into biographies. First, it would take much too long because she's done so much, but also because you can read those easily online. But we have, over many months, discussed what's going to happen today to talk, excuse me, to talk about the quite remarkable work that Joyce, her colleagues, and the Tanenbaum Center have done over a period of years, including with David Little, who is here, to identify and to bring together people with a religious motivation who are working for peace. And we are celebrating and presenting today the second volume of Peacemakers in Action. So that is a first mission. A second one is to share both among the group that Joyce will introduce and with you some reflections on what we've learned and what the challenges are as we look forward that come out of this all too rare experience of looking deliberately, professionally, creatively, and passionately, I would say, at the remarkable work of people who are working for peace in some of the most difficult situations in the world with some new ideas that are too little celebrated. So with that, I will hand over to Joyce.
Thank you. Are we going to get Hind up there? She's coming. Okay. So I'm going to start by saying thank you to my friend and colleague, Catherine, and good afternoon. I'm going to start with the thank yous. First to our friends at the Berkley Center, Sean, Catherine, Carly Henry. Thanks for hosting us today. I appreciate it. I also want to call out Susan Hayward from USIP and Catherine in particular, because both shared great wisdom and really helped us as we began to evolve the paper that we have prepared from our learnings in the book. I also want to acknowledge the Henry Luce Foundation. Not only did they support this paper, but they also helped us to create the book, Volume 2, Peacemakers in Action, and supported our work with several universities and scholars. Now, is this too close? Let me know how it works. And finally, I want to support two of Tanenbaum's Peacemakers who are here today, Bill Lowrey, who's sitting over there, and Hind Kabawat, who's joining us from Geneva. And we'll get to them in a few minutes. But for now, a little bit about Tanenbaum. Our full name is the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. We're over 25 years old and began our peacebuilding work over 20 years ago. In that work, we do three things. We identify religious peacemakers, which is frankly not always such an easy task. And then we study the work that they do and work with them in what is now a network that is operationalized. We call them our peacemakers in action, and we use 5 criteria to identify them. They need to be, first and foremost, religiously motivated to be working for peace, working or having worked in an armed conflict. At least some of their work needs to be locally based. When they're selected, they have to be relatively unknown, and their lives or freedom have to have been at risk, either because of where they live or choices that they've made. To date, we've named 32 peacemakers in action, 28 of whom are living and comprise the network. Working with them has taught us invaluable lessons, including that their on-the-ground proximity to local communities and their connections, commitment, and creative solutions make them powerful potential partners when their goals and efforts are aligned with our foreign policy. So the discussion today is not to tell you that this is a good idea, working with them. That's our premise. Rather, it's to talk about the obstacles to starting to work with them, to maintaining relationships with them, and to institutionalizing such partnerships, and to present a few recommendations on how to get started in doing this. So first, 5 obstacles that keep diplomats from identifying and engaging with religious peace builders. Number 1, it's hard to find them. That's because religious peace builders are incredibly diverse. Their societal roles and their activities come in different shapes and sizes. Some are people of the cloth, but many are not. And the way they work is very varied. That's why at Tanenbaum, when we define religious peacemakers, we look at their motivation and their vision. Religion drives them to pursue peace. And they have a vision that they are always pursuing, no matter what work they are doing, to achieve a lived peace. So you can't find them only among religious leaders. And that's true, even though many of us are still conditioned to think of religious peace builders as the people who have visible power, either because they're in a religious hierarchy and high up, or just because they have a title within that hierarchy. That tendency may explain why even people who talk about the importance of working with religious leaders and religious activists still often lapse into talking and framing the group as religious leaders. And in many traditions, that is code for men. It's time for us to be thinking and talking about these individuals as religious actors that include some religious leaders, not all, and also the powerful activists who are so often overlooked, including women, youth, indigenous religious actors, and those beyond the Abrahamic traditions. Another thing that we've learned from working with our peacemakers is that religious peace building is a vocation, but it's not quite like other professions, lawyers, doctors, because it isn't defined by the type of job you have. Rather, it's defined by why you do what you do and how you use your work to what end. So an example, our Muslim peacemaker from the north of Israel, she's an elementary school principal who would see her greatest achievement as developing a peace project with a nearby Jewish principal so that their students and their communities, the parents of those students, would come to know one another as people and not just as enemies. Likewise, our peacemaker from Colombia, a Mennonite lawyer whose early work helped ensure legal protections for conscientious objection to military service, but who also works on the ground and has always worked on the ground as well. And it includes Bill and Hind, who is somewhere on the screen to be found. Obstacle number 2. Even though our diplomats are increasingly partnering with human rights, development, security, and even secular peace builders, they still tend to view the religious peace actors as a distinct phenomenon, with the result that they are often siloed and seen as something to be looked at and held askance. And this creates barriers to partnering. I think it happens particularly in the West, because we have a conceptual wall between what we call religious and what we call secular. But it's also because, frankly, a lot of people have discomfort around religion. And they think that anything that's deemed religious doesn't belong in that secular world, like the workplace, even though, of course, it's there. These are ingrained perspectives, and they stymie our diplomatic efforts. What's important is to recognize that religious peacemakers have a unique motivation, but that their work and activities often overlap with their secular counterparts. Their techniques, their activities are what we do call secular. So, a perfect example, our South African peacemaker, Nozizwe Madlala Rutledge. She's a devout Quaker, and she's held a range of very secular roles, an anti-apartheid activist, a deputy minister of defense, even as a Quaker, and a leader of a nonprofit that was addressing sex trafficking. In each, she viewed her work through the lens of religion, and when it came to being Deputy Minister of Defense, actually got recommendations on how to guide herself from her Quaker community. Always, she pursued a more just and peaceful community. The tendency to segregate the religious peace actors as doing somehow different work clouds our vision, and it can thwart our capacity to recognize the right people, enter into partnerships, and improve our diplomacy and our outcomes. Obstacle 3. And this one is kind of related to the one I just discussed. It has to do with preconceived notions and how they influence our foreign policy, and the work that is done with religious peacemakers. I'm talking about societal stereotypes and their influence. All of us know that the daily headlines are a drumbeat, and that the media people consume fuels both their explicit and implicit biases and prejudices, and that this is influencing and does influence public attitudes. But that influence is not limited to some vague public. It also affects those who are involved in foreign policy. It influences how they view religion, how they view religious actors and peace actors, their openness to working with them, and it even influences policy. So Tanenbaum, as an example, we view the travel ban as an example of this. That's why we've actually joined in a series of amicus briefs opposing it. In our view, the ban conflates Islam and terrorism. And in the name of national security, it's largely targeting Muslim-majority countries. The problem with this approach is that it's built on stereotypes that are not supported by the facts. In the U.S., the majority of homegrown terrorist acts are committed by white supremacists. And terrorism shows up across religious traditions, including with the extremist Buddhists in Myanmar. We believe the travel ban has troubling policy implications. It formalizes an implicit policy of non-engagement with people from a particular religious tradition, and it can result in lost opportunities for engaging some of those people in religious peace building. To be fair, that's not the only thing that's happening in diplomacy around the world. There are examples of nations and international bodies overcoming such societal influences, but the challenge remains. It needs to be named, and it needs to be addressed. Two more quick obstacles, but serious ones. The first, we've failed to institutionalize religion as a factor to be considered in many of our diplomatic calculations. And that's true even though the vast majority of people worldwide identify as religious, and even though increasingly you'll get consensus that religion is not only a driver of conflict, but it's also a potential source for healing, development, and peace building. Though intellectually, we realize that religion is infused in social, political, economic, and institutional realities in areas of strategic interest. Figuring out exactly how to map and navigate this phenomenon and making that part of our routine thinking, analysis, and strategies remains an elusive goal. That's a challenge. And finally, obstacle number 5. Diplomats are rarely well prepared to address religion and partner with religious peace builders. To be sure, some progress has been made at the Foreign Service Institute, but more, much more is needed. In a minute, I'll move from this to turning this over to Hind and Bill, and to ask them to talk with you about their peace building work and their reflections on the challenges that they see for peacemakers, religious peacemakers, working with diplomats. But first, I want to point out where I started with the first obstacle. They exemplify the diversity among religious peacemakers. Both are motivated by faith. Both work on the ground. But Bill is an ordained reverend, and Hind is deemed to be a secular woman who's actually very religiously motivated and trained as a lawyer. So Hind, I want to start with you. You're a religious actor, not a traditional religious leader. These days, you're focused on seeking peace for Syrians. One day, you're working at a school for refugees, and the next, you're with diplomats. So your peace work is varied and seemingly secular. In fact, just a few days ago, I happen to know this, you were in Jordan and Gaziantep at the border of Turkey and Syria. Now we're talking to you from your office in Geneva. Those places and what you do seem unrelated. The work at Gaziantep is at a school. It's education. It doesn't per se look like peace work. So let me ask you, can you describe the 3 ways you pursue your vision for peace and share what you see as the greatest obstacle for religious peace builders working with diplomats and moving peace building forward across sectors? Hind?
I don't know. Good afternoon for you. And thank you for having me. First, how is the weather?
It's really nice.
Very nice. And in Geneva also is spring. So thank you very much for having me. I want to thank, of course, Tanenbaum Center, my great support for our work, and also Berkley Center for giving me the opportunity to join Joyce. First, I just want to talk about the challenge that so many of the diplomats still think that religions can be the problem in the Middle East. Of course, I believe that the problem also we can have a solution if we can really work on religions in a good positive way. First, I just want to tell you about the three things I work on. Let's start with the grassroots, as Joyce mentioned. We work on grassroots. I have two women's centers, one in Gaza at the border in Idlib. We have for those women. We teach them English, Arabic, computers. And the surface, it will look like education, but really we do lots of peacebuilding, negotiation, mediation. And me as a Christian, I always like to show the value of the Christianity. And this is really working very well because my friends, my colleagues, we all multi-faith, and we either taking care of those Muslim women who are stuck in war zone. We give them at least twice or three times a week type lectures. We teach them about communication, negotiation, and these things. Teach them about other religions, about their values, and we learn from them their values. We teach them about soft power. And let me tell you the story. Last month, the European Union informed us that they're going to support our school in Georgia. But they say if there will be any change or any terrorist group come to this village, this support will be stopped and the project will be frozen. I immediately sent a voicemail to my colleagues and to the women and the teachers that are all in WhatsApp. I passed the message to the European Union that listen, they are willing to support this center again this year, but in one condition, you cannot have any Nusra or any terrorists coming to this village. Those women, they immediately work so hard and start working around the villages, around this village in Georgia, and told their husband, we don't want any terrorist group coming to our village because we don't want the center closed. And you do what you have to do. Immediately, there is 5 statements coming from other local councils in Italy saying, we are forbidden and not to come close to our village. This is the woman who we worked on. And they do know that Christians, Muslims, Jews, all kinds, we all work together in stopping a terrorist group from to those villages. Also, 2 weeks ago, I went to the Center of Religion and Diplomacy, my school with my colleague, Dr. Berkley, and we did a election workshop in the refugee camps in Jordan. And here we are, Christian, Jewish, Muslims, working together to provide skills and support for those Muslim women. This is the real religion. This is the work we do.
All right, I'm going to introduce you to Bill. And so you're going to get a slightly disjointed set of presentations, but they're all important, and we'll circle back. Bill Lowrey, for over 25 years, worked in Sudan and now South Sudan. There was a time when you worked with local, indigenous, tribal, and religious leaders and actually established a peace, a time of peace that lasted for 15 years. It's deteriorated now, as we all know. And that reminds us of several things. That peace building is critically important, that it may not last forever, but even when it lasts for a time, that makes a difference, and that it's not linear. So as a religious person and a member of the clergy, and someone who has researched indigenous peacemaking in Sudan for your PhD, can you talk to us about your work, its interface with diplomacy, and what you are seeing today?
Thank you, Joyce. I hope I can be a sufficient distraction while the other is being worked on. I went to South Sudan 27 years ago as a mission co-worker of the Presbyterian Church USA. And my stated role was as a humanitarian worker working in rebel-controlled areas. However, what transformed my own life was working side by side with church leaders, women's leaders, chiefs, elders, and youth. They engaged me in peace work as an outsider who could help strengthen the hands and feet of the insider mediators and peacemakers. My previous training had all been in Western styles of conflict resolution. But what I witnessed was South Sudanese indigenous or traditional methods of peacemaking. It was irresistible to me, and so I did my dissertation focused on the study of indigenous peacemaking. I discovered the strength of oral cultures. I discovered face-to-face dynamic peace conversations with the enemy. I discovered uninterrupted storytelling as a means to identify issues to be resolved, as well as values to be sustained. Customary laws with interpretation and application by the oldest and wisest chiefs. Consensus decision-making, even when it may take days to reach it. And powerful rituals that range from sprinkling feet with water for the preparation of peace work to sacrificing a white bull or burying a broken spear as a final sealing of a covenant of peace. Furthermore, I witnessed the power of an oral culture after a traditional peace agreement that I helped facilitate. They enrolled the masses in committing to the peace. The indigenous leaders did that by enacting in multiple locations the stories of the peacemaking conference and the sacrifice of the bull. And they enlisted the common people with vows of commitment to live out the covenant of peace. I recognized quite easily that I could not bring those indigenous methods of peace to the United States. But it also became crystal clear to me that if I tried to force Western methods on a culture that already had their own successful traditional methods of making peace, then that effort also would likely fail. I'd like for you to hold on to that thought. I'll come back to it in a moment. For those who might not be as familiar with South Sudan, for decades, the southern Sudanese people fought for their independence with only brief periods of relative peace. Finally, in 2011, they became the newest independent nation in the world. Those who had fought from the bush became leaders of the new country. They had little experience in governance. Old grievances soon surfaced. New wealth from oil enticed corruption. A provisional constitution never got completed. The judiciary had no time or experience to become independent or robust. And other countries and international businesses lusted for the wealth of resources in the baby country. Within 2.5 years, a South-South war burst out as the single-party control of the SPLM fractured, tribal loyalties shaped alliances, and brutal violence took over the country. Now this civil war has entered its 5th year, and the crisis is huge. death tolls estimates range from 50,000 as a low to 300,000 as a high. 2 million people have fled the country in every direction. Another 2 million are internally displaced within the country, and another 212,000 have taken refuge in United Nations protection of civilian camps scattered across the country in major population centers. South Sudanese citizens are too frightened of their own government, their own military, and their own neighbors to venture out of these camps. I was there with them in one of those camps in January. The economy has collapsed. The number of opposition military groups fighting the government forces has multiplied. Refugee camps are filled with women and children who tell horrifying stories of rape, murder, plunder, and trauma. So how can this ever come to an end? Everyone seems to ask. The international community has tried to help, but it has a singular approach, Western in methodology. In 2014, the principle of subsidiarity was applied to the South Sudan conflict. That principle says that matters ought to be handled by the least centralized, competent authority. Therefore, the UN turned to the African Union, who turned to IGAD, the Intergovernmental Agency for Development in East Africa. At that point, no one seemed to believe that South Sudanese could find a way to solve their own conflict. So, in my language, subsidiarity was truncated at the East African regional level. IGAD designated a primary negotiator, chose Addis Ababa as the venue for negotiations, made the heads of governments of IGAD and their Council of Ministers the primary authority, which generates proposals, calls meetings, and applies pressure. The Troika, made up of the US, the UK, and Norway, with support from EU partners, provides resources, issues statements of warnings, tries to apply pressure, and gives technical support to IGAD. IGAD itself is made up of countries that have conflicting agenda between the countries and in relationship with South Sudan. The government of South Sudan is a member of IGAD. It has not recused itself or been forced to recuse, so it is both an antagonist in the conflict and a decision maker of how IGAD facilitates the negotiations. The methodology is Western. The primary participants are those with armed forces. Actors like religious, traditional, women, youth, and civil society are kept on the margins. Meetings are held in nice hotels in Ethiopia for brief numbers of days, managed by outsiders, proposing ways to accommodate the elite actors. An agreement in 2015 was signed and collapsed within a couple of months in 2016 with escalated violence. Now, a high-level revitalization forum is trying to bring life to an old agreement. But in December, a cessation of hostilities agreement was signed and it collapsed within hours. A statement of principles could not even be agreed to in the recent meeting, and this month, IGAD will try again, designating only 4 days for the meeting. Little hope is expressed by anyone closely connected with this process. Now contrast this with South Sudanese insider mediators. Traditional and religious leaders have trust of the people, experience, and wisdom. For centuries, traditional chiefs and elders, Kormon and spearmasters, paramount chiefs and kings have led their people to resolve conflicts, developed extensive customary laws, and passed them down through their oral culture. They are a rich resource. However, they are not well organized across the nation as an institution, and they do not have experience in resolving this level of national conflict. They bring wisdom, experience, and influence with the masses and with young fighters who make up the fighting forces of opposing groups. But the longer the war continues, the more the focus of these tribal groups will be on their own tribal interest rather than the interest of a nation. In 1991, the New Sudan Council of Churches was organized in the town of Tarit, linking all the churches in a common structure. For 27 years now, it has built itself as a unified institution that has a primary focus on peace. In almost every town, there is an interchurch committee. They are engaged with all denominations, women, youth, and ministers, and they have close relationships with the traditional chiefs and elders across all ethnic and factional divides. In 1997, the church met with the SPLM movement, and they all agreed that the church should be in the lead role for building peace between conflicting movements and between tribes. In 1998, the people-to-people peace process was initiated in the town of Loki, engaging both chiefs and church leaders, blending traditional methods and rituals with modern ones. In 1999, the Woonlit Peace Conference brought an end to an 8-year war between Dinka and Nuer and provided stability for the next 15 years until the current war broke out in 2013. I facilitated the first 3 people-to-people conferences held in Loki and Woonlit and Wat, and can testify to the potential and power of this type of South Sudanese methodology. This year, as a part of their action plan for peace, the South Sudan Council of Churches has just in the last couple of months trained some 250 community peace facilitators, and they have launched community conversation gatherings across the South. This effort has been funded by USAID and is managed through CRS as the church provides the leadership. These local conversations allow people to tell their stories, lament their pain and suffering from this war, and identify core issues that must be resolved both at the local and the national level. And it also helps mobilize the people to be agents of peace. Recently, both the government and the opposition forces have again asked the church to bring them together face to face. So why not build a revised approach designed as a blend of both traditional and modern peacemaking methodologies? There is a loose consortium that has been working in back-channel and multi-track approaches that could help build a bridge between insider mediators and the current Track 1 diplomacy of IGAD and the Troika. For more than a year now, 2 Tanenbaum peacemakers have been working behind the scenes to try to shift the power dynamics of the conflict. My role has been to link multi-tracks and strengthen the work of church, chief, and women leaders. My colleague, Peacemaker, has been on the ground in the region, building personal trust relationships within the government SPLM, with the former detainees, and with the diverse opposition groups, both military and political, working toward a common negotiating approach, and also interacting at a high level with the regional governments that make up IGAD and the Troika. In January 2018, we held a quiet retreat of 12 people so that different insider and outsider interlocutors could coordinate their efforts in supporting inside mediators and creating links to Track 1 efforts. So what is missing? For the South Sudan conflict, there is a huge gap that exists. On one side is the Track 1 diplomatic approach that has placed all of its focus and hopes on the IGAD High-Level Revitalization Forum and used basically Western styles of peacemaking. On the other side of the gap are the multi-track efforts of traditional and faith-inspired insider mediators who are connected to both the masses and the elites and have an understanding of traditional methods that could give confidence and hope to the South Sudanese people and antagonist. The South Sudan Council of Churches and its action plan for peace is the leader in this effort. A robust bridge needs to be built across this huge gap. The diplomats who sit in the seat of power must take the initiative to support the building of that bridge. The principle of subsidiarity that has been truncated at the level of EGOD must be extended so that traditional and faith-inspired insider mediators are brought into the process as full partners who can help redesign the peace process to blend both traditional and modern methods. A consortium of international support exists already for EGOD through the Troika, AU, UN, EU, and others, but I believe it is operating with blinders. A loose consortium also exists that supports the insider mediators, and many of its members have stated they are ready to escalate their commitments when they see that the door is open for a true partnership that can bridge the current gap. May a breakthrough come sooner rather than later. Famine threatens in the coming months. Arms flow into the hands of antagonists. Women are raped and refugees flee. And darkness chases even residents in Juba into their homes, fearing the unknown gunmen, as they're called, who target the vulnerable at night. If you are in a position of influence and power, I challenge you to help build the bridge of partnership that is desperately needed in South Sudan today. Thank you.
Okay, so please state your name, where you're from, and your question.
Hello, my name is John Birnbaum, and I'm from the Washington, D.C. area. I've worked in Russia for 25 years, trying to deal with some issues like this, but I'm particularly interested in the last sentence. It said you were going to talk about the importance of aligning diplomats with like-minded religious actors, but I didn't hear much of that in your presentation. Were you successful in getting diplomats to build bridges to peacemakers on the street? I just have to say real briefly, I worked with 7 different ambassadors in Moscow in 25 years. Not any one of them knew anything about the Russian Orthodox Church, for example, which is amazing to me because it's the most trusted institution after the collapse of communism. How is it possible that you're an ambassador of a country and you know nothing about the Orthodox Church? So that's the kind of wall I found. Did you find that kind of thing as well? Sorry.
Yeah, notice that it said you were going to talk about the importance of it. So it is important, even though it often is not happening. And so my point here with South Sudan is that you've got a diplomatic approach taking place that is primarily Western in its approach and does not have the connections with the grassroots. And when you've got a country that's only existed for a few years, and the war broke out in 2.5 years from the time of formation as a country, that country is not really thinking and acting like a nation state. It is thinking and acting much more like the subcultures within it, ethnic groups, and the background they have. Their background says that they are all to be involved in some way in the peace process. Instead, what they perceive is that the peace process will happen in Addis, and then it will be announced. And oftentimes, when there are new proposals which come from EGOD, they are quickly rejected either by the government or the opposition forces. And oftentimes, that is because they have not felt like they have been full participants in that. So this is my plea, that it is possible. There are people in the religious community who have these connections across South Sudan who are ready and eager to work with the diplomats. What usually happens at the high-level revitalization forum is there will be a representative of the churches who will be asked to come. He'll be asked to open in prayer, and when it ends, he'll be asked to close in prayer. That is not serious partnership in that. I know the bishop who will be there in a couple of weeks, and he will pray a good prayer. But that is not the best way to make use of these kind of resources that are in the country.
There are more questions, but I'm wondering, in particular, given this question, if maybe we can do something else before we get to the questions, which is I'd like to share the recommendations that we've developed for addressing some of the obstacles, including the difficulty of getting these partnerships to be real and not only conceptual or not only pleas. So if that's all right with you, maybe I'll just go to the conclusion. We'll fit Hind in if we can, because what she has to say is very important, and then hear your further questions. I want to go back for a moment. I'm having my own mic challenges here. I want to go back for a moment to the key idea that we've been talking about, what you were just talking about, that religiously motivated actors for peace are powerful, potential, real partners for our diplomacy and for peace building. And that means that the capacity to identify them and work with them actually needs to be institutionalized as a core competence of our diplomats and our foreign services personnel. So we have 3 recommendations for getting started. They're not the whole answer, but they're some ideas for things that we should be doing. The first, and it's really the elephant in the room whenever you have this conversation, is that we need a concerted effort to address the money question. Currently, there's insufficient funding dedicated to peace building, religious actors, or what some people call soft efforts. The 2019 budget needs to remedy that, and the State Department needs to make a commitment to establishing religious competency across all of its operations. This is not just a nice idea. It's actually the foundation for accessing and working effectively, for partnering, if you will, with religious peace builders. And that, I think, is critical to national security and needs to be linked with it. The second recommendation, foreign services personnel, to your point, need to be better prepared to do this. They need religious and cultural competency training. What's happening at the Foreign Services Institute should be expanded into a synchronized series of trainings with clear objectives. And those objectives should include, among others, building strategic skills like how do you map and then evaluate the influence of religion on daily local life, and in the economic, social, environmental, and political factors that influence a conflict and a region. To your point about the Orthodox Church. Another is they have to learn skills. We have to build skills in how to identify those religious actors well beyond those religious leaders that we default to. And that is something that can be learned. Another learning objective would be building what we call intercultural engagement skills so that we can increase partnership readiness among foreign services personnel. It includes cross-cultural communications, things Hind was talking about, but also identifying different types of inter- and intra-religious dynamics, recognizing what they might be, looking for them, identifying them, assessing them in any particular context. And they include exploring one's own explicit and implicit bias. That's beginning to happen in institutions like workplaces, and it needs to happen as well for foreign diplomacy. We have to look at how our own biases the own influences that we carry with us, the assumptions that are built into who we are, influence our assessments and our decisions. Such trainings are important. But they're also going to have to do other things. They're going to have to dig deeper into some key ideas that we hear voiced all the time when you're talking about diplomat religious peacemaker partnerships. But I'm not sure that we all agree or really understand what they mean. For instance, what does it mean to be transparent? We say that if we're going to build partnerships, there has to be transparency. What does that mean if you're a diplomat and you represent a country and its interests? How do you put the two together? We say there needs to be trust. I think that's real. We are talking about relationships here. We're not talking about 2-year relationships and then goodbye, I'm gone, and maybe someone will find you, and maybe they won't, and maybe they'll work with you, and maybe they won't, and maybe my country will be here, and maybe it won't. We're talking about relationships and people. How do you build that trust? And how do you build it if you don't have transparency? And what do we mean when we say that religious peace builders should not be instrumentalized? I hear that framework all the time. It makes perfect sense to me. But I don't think people agree on what that means and what that looks like. We have to define it. We have to explore it. We have to think about, is this instrumentalizing or not? With clear objectives, a preparedness to address these types of amorphous concepts, and comprehensive ongoing training, because this is a learning that is a lifetime of learning. This is not something that you go to a course and then you've got it. We can build a cadre of foreign services personnel that are better equipped than they are today to ask the right questions, to engage with religious people in the communities they serve, and to identify from among them the religious peace actors, both leaders and apparently more secular people, and build real partnerships with them. Final recommendation, and it's probably obvious. We believe the State Department should be working with trustworthy religious peace building networks and institutions that are addressing the power of religion. Many can provide context, connections, key information, and perspectives. I would suggest the Tanenbaum's Peacemakers Network is a key example, as is the Berkley Center, USIP, the network of traditional and religious peacemakers, and so many others. Many of them are here. They're in DC. And the rest are generally available by email unless you're trying to work on Skype or Zoom or whatever that is. And many will be from more familiar traditions, Abrahamic traditions, and many will not. They'll be from different traditions. But engaging the organizations and the institutions that are dedicated to this is part of institutionalizing religious competency and getting the results that we're seeking in valuable partnerships. So, I mean, for me, the bottom line in all of this is that you're here today. And that says to me that this idea that religious peace actors, religious peace builders, can be allies in can be, maybe not always, but can be allies in foreign affairs, is getting mainstreamed. The issue now is not just to have it as an idea, but to have it as a practice, and one that transcends a couple of years ago or a couple of years from now, but becomes an institutionalized way of operating. Now, do we have Hind or no? We have her. Okay, Hind. Hind, I did a quick summary of where you were, and so that you were talking about the 3 ways you do peace building, not all of which will appear to be, religiously driven, and you had talked about your grassroots work, and you were getting to your second point.
So I'm not going to repeat about our work in the grassroots, which is very important for the peace work, because you are working with civil societies, especially in area like Idlib. There is some sort of few terrorist group, but in the end of the way, in the end of the day, there's so many civil societies and women group we need to support. So we find the best way is to empower those women, to empower those civil societies, and live by examples. Since I'm Christian, I need to stand by the oppressed against the oppressors. I need to fight for their values of to build a better, inclusive, democratic Syria. So this is what we're doing in the grassroots, and it is so important to get a role model for everybody that, yes, even we're Christians, and I'm Christian, but I don't side only with Christians. I will be with the oppressed and helping for the good in Syria. So number two, work. I know we don't have too much time, but I do lots of mediation between religious groups. Let's face it, we have lots of, the Syrian regime is trying to influence a sectarianism sentiment, which this is creating a lots of gap between many religious groups. Like let's say in Easter, while they will be around Damascus, there is forced displacement for so many civilians, Muslims. The regime sent an order to the Christians and to the churches to get down to the street and celebrate Easter. I know so many Christians, they do feel the pain of the Muslims' neighbors and how much it hurts so many people. They have to leave their home in forced displacement to go up north. And many Christians, they weren't very happy about this order. Nevertheless, we send the messages to the Muslims, Syrians, and they are our neighbors and brother and sisters from the Christians community saying, listen, we might be forced to, some of us, to be in the streets celebrating Easter, but we cannot celebrate while you are suffering. This kind of good messages, this will help us live together in the futures. The Assad regime is saying there is terrorists and there is Syrian regime, but it's wrong. We have in the middle lots of civil society, moderate people such like myself. We work for democracy, freedom, and better futures. So a good messages can be sent and they can be credible when you send it in the time of the war, so you can lower the tension among other group. And this is the duty and the work for any good Christians. So here I can just confirm that you have to practice your Christianity in the time of the war in a positive way, to be the bridge between, in the case of Syria, between the Christian, Muslim, and the Alawite. You need to be the bridge. You cannot increase the tension between them. So when you find some of the groups are celebrating the suffering and the death for other group, you have to immediately jump to this opportunity to say, no, they can't do this and this is wrong. And you have to make peace among them, and through good messages and good and good dialogue and create it. While we're finishing with the grassroots and the mediation among religious groups, here in Geneva, part of the Geneva missions for the Syrian Negotiation Committee, where we believe in the negotiation, in a political solution. Of course, Syrian regime refusing to negotiate with us because they think that war is the answer, and killing and torturing and forced displacement for the people, they can shut them down and we don't need to do any negotiation. So for them is building Syria on top of the grave and the body of dead people can work. But we do believe that we need to have a negotiation. That's why we work with lots of women to include them to the negotiation table. We work on including civil societies. We work on constitution committees to have a constitution can reflect the pluralism and have everybody involved with these constitutions and have a social contract among Syrian so we can believe in secular, civil, democratic Syria. This is the work, and it's very hard to change your hats between grassroots and being running schools, then mediation among tensions. Like only yesterday we got this tape. People are singing and dancing and in the middle of a club, and it hurt because so many people in Damascus, they know and they heard about the green buses who got all those poor Muslim people to get them outside Damascus, outside up to the north. So you need always to help and be a good mediator so you can help to build peace. So just to share with you how difficult it is to change your hats and to be one day in a grassroots, one day a mediator, one day in a fancy office in Geneva and working with the UN with others to increase and to have a role for a political solution and to support your negotiation team. But in the end of the day, I can say that being a Christian and believe in my values, believe in my Bible, who taught me how to always stand with the poor, always stand with the oppressed, and think about a revolution is not a terrorism or it's not something. We have to fight against the dictator, and we need to fight against a Khalifa. And this both, a good Christians with good values can be always a bridge. That's what we do now. We are working to build bridges among other religions group and tell them, listen, yes, not all the Christians, they hate Muslim, and not all the Alawites hate Muslim, and not all the Muslim. We have good people from everybody. We have a good Syrian people who they don't believe in sectarianism. They believe in one Syria, and we have to live together. So I just want to finish this in saying we shouldn't lose hope. I know it's look very ugly in Syria, but I'm telling you, thanks to so many of my colleagues from multi-faith and multi-religions, they work tirelessly day and night to have a future, peaceful future. And I'm so proud to belong to the Syrian Negotiation Committee, and they believe in peace and prosperity for the Syrian people.
Thank you to all of you for these very moving and informative presentations. So we have some time for questions. Theoretically, we're ending at 1:30, but we can spill over a bit for those of you who can stay. So, Dane. The microphone is coming.
Thank you. Dane Smith from the American Friends of the Episcopal Church of the Sudan. Bill, I was very much interested in the work you're doing with this group that met quietly. You spoke about a retreat, which as I understood it, was going to try to get connected with the Track 1 group that follows this Western model that you say is disconnected. I'd be interested in what you could share about that, and also point out that one of the difficulties with the so-called Western model and subsidiarity is that IGAD, which has been assigned to the task, is terribly divided at this moment. The Ethiopians are quite preoccupied with other things. The Kenyans aren't really engaged. So it has basically been Museveni who has been the major actor within IGAD, and he's considered to be fully aligned with Salva Kiir. So I wonder if you could give us some ideas about how you can connect into that network.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Does it work? Okay. Yeah, it's limited as to how much I can say about that quiet meeting, but it was our first time to get a dozen of us together, and it went all the way from bishops on the ground and women's leaders on the ground up to a member of the Troika and folks who are connected with the AU and European Union, and so it's just important behind the scenes to be connecting people so that the track one can connect in some ways with the multi-tracks. So I think we're making a little progress, but I've heard it said a number of times, it's almost like that we've got to wait for IGAD to implode before something else will be developed. And I've heard members of IGAD as well as the Troika say, we have put all of our eggs in this IGAD basket. We have no resources that we are willing to commit outside of that basket. And so while at the same time they might acknowledge, many would acknowledge, certainly it wouldn't be all, but many would acknowledge they don't see hope for where this is going. But at the same time, they don't want to put the energy into creating any other possibility of a way to blend something or connect. And so this becomes the chicken and the eggs. Does IGAD have to implode before something new can arise? Or wouldn't it be much better if while IGAD is struggling, and at the last meeting, the prime negotiator for IGAD and the government representatives and the opposition representatives all spoke to the church leaders and said, we need you to help bring these people together. But that is being said behind the scenes. No one is making public statements about that. And there is a concern if the Council of Churches really took an initiative that almost was perceived by some as being a counter-negotiating process to IGAD, then and IGAD failed, they could be blamed for being the ones who sabotage IGAD. And they're not going to do that. There was one point in Addis where the government and the opposition groups basically said, we do not want IGAD to be a part of it. We want the church to stand here with us and help us sit and talk together. And they did that. Most people think it is not possible for them to do that, but this is a South Sudanese style. Face to face with your enemies, someone you trust in the middle, helping to sort of moderate it so that they can eventually work toward, in their style, consensus is the ultimate solution, rather than proposals coming from the outside that are take it or leave it kind of things. So there's some encouragement that I see that the conversations are going on, but they're not going on rapidly. They're not made a top priority. And in the meantime, so many people are dying. And the country continues to collapse more and more. So it's hard to have hope. I did have one church leader on my last day when I was there in January. I was in Kenya and in Juba and in Uganda. And a church leader on my last night said, Bill, I believe that you are going to live long enough to see peace in South Sudan. And I believe that you are going to come back and you are going to see it with your own eyes. Well, it's that kind of hope that rests in so many of the masses of the people of South Sudan who actually keeps them going. And I'm thankful for that hope.
Why don't we?
Thanks to both of you. I learned a lot.
Could you just introduce yourselves? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mindy Reiser. I'm Vice President of an NGO called Global Peace Services, USA. I have a brief observation and then two questions. I know that in Rwanda there was a process called gacaca, where people who had learning and skills in traditional peacemaking worked with the victims of those who had caused enormous damage and death in villages and elsewhere. There were peacemaking overtures. I don't know how that was sustained after the process was over. So that's leading to my question to you. You mentioned a 15-year process that held. What enabled it to hold when the initial peacemaking efforts were undertaken? You talked about sacrifices, you talked about the wise people who played a pivotal role. So what sustained that? That's really critical to make these things hold. And the other question is, and this is for you, Joyce, have you thought about working with the UN peacemaking efforts to involve religious people who have the trust of the local communities? The peacemakers find themselves in many different situations. They come from different ethnic and cultural traditions. So that might be something for you to explore. You may have already. So questions to both of you.
Just a couple of comments about gacaca. It was a traditional methodology that was not designed for a national system. And so this is the challenge when you've got this traditional wisdom and things that have worked in the past in certain kind of tribal conflicts. It doesn't automatically extend to a national framework. And so they learned a lot of things from that process. There were people who died because of that process, because the threat came that if you were able to confess and get amnesty, then you might show others who have participated, and then people began to do killings outside of that. So, I mean, these are very complex things. There's no simple solution to all of this. However, what we need to do, and they did in Rwanda, is to recognize there's some values there, there's certain levels of conflict resolution that can take place and even reconciliation that can take place. And then there are other things that have to be extended, like to a national court. And a hybrid court has been called for in South Sudan between the international community and the South Sudanese community. And it's in the hands of the AU, and it is not moving very well. But eventually that will need to happen. And so to learn from the traditional methods will be helpful that way. In terms of why did it continue for those years? The largest conflict in South Sudan, besides the North-South conflict, was the Dinka-Nuer War that had been going for 7.5 years. There were factional lines in that as well as ethnic lines in that. And so when at Woonlit that was resolved, we had days of storytelling, which had to surface then all the issues that had to be resolved. Every one of them had to be resolved by consensus. And then those issues, once they were resolved, then there was a process of covenanting together as to what was the peace. Now, we had 300 actual delegates and about 2,000 to 3,000 of us who were there. And this was in a village that was built by 350 young people over 3 months, believing if they build it, they'll come and make peace. And they did. So when that was over, all those who were gathered there in this oral culture, they were committed to it, but that didn't make the masses committed. So in an oral culture, it's very different from having documents that you can distribute by internet and everybody can read it and know what the agreement is, nor do they have the belief that you just trust the leaders. A few people can go off and make peace and come back and announce it. Rather, they think they have to have participation in this. So enough people must be involved that they feel represented. That's a little nebulous, but they have to feel it. But then they went around to these holy places, and using their oral culture, they told the stories of the peacemaking, and they again sacrificed a bull in the holy places, And then, just as they did at Woonlet, they said, if you violate this covenant, your blood will flow like the blood of the bull. And so you must commit to this. So the enrolling process is using an oral culture approach to get a commitment from thousands of people to carry on the peace. Then immediately there were benefits of peace. In the places where no traders could come, suddenly within a week, traders were moving. In the places where the fisheries could not be used because people would kill one another, suddenly they were opened up and people were going to the water points and they were fishing and getting the fish. The grazing lands, the Teutsch, was opened up for the cattle. So those became very concrete. We had 69 women who had been abducted, some abducted from marriages, some abducted as single women. Some had now children from their abductor, children from their original husband. None of these were proper marriages. All of them were cause for conflict. They developed in the Woonlit Conference a process for how all 69 of these would be resolved. Parents went to the daughter, said, you are now free to return to your husband if you wish. If you do not wish, we will turn this into a proper marriage and do the bride price here. If you have children from your abductor, those children by customary law belong to the original husband. We will escort them back to that husband, who has never seen these children. These are customary laws developed over centuries of time. We would never come up with such solutions. But they could do that, and then that helps build peace at the ground level. That takes traditional chiefs, traditional elders, and church leaders, religious leaders, all working together, because none of them represent everybody.
We're over time and there are a lot of hands, but Joyce, why don't you give a quick answer, and then maybe we'll hear the other questions so we know what's on people's minds, and then people who need to go will obviously filter out.
Okay, and you'll make notes as to what everybody wants to know about, so we'll remember. The answer is we are involved to some extent with the UN, but the work that the UN is doing with religious peace builders and peace actors it is somewhat different than the work that we do. And related, and that's why we are good partners for them. And I had a very interesting conversation with a leader from the UN who works on this, which is that when they look for religious peacemakers or religious peace builders, they go to institutions to find them. We are always looking for the individual. And what I am suggesting today is that in addition to working with the institutions, it is critical to have the skill set when one is in a conflict or in a community to identify the individuals. Some of them will be connected to institutions, but some of them operate without institutions. And if you don't find them and you don't work with them, it's a lost opportunity.
Good. Well, let's start with Mitch. We're going to take a series of questions now, so anyone who has them on their mind.
My name is Mitch, and I am from World Vision International, from the Faith and Development team, and my area of interest is anthropology of religion in development. This is actually what I teach at Catholic University. And, this is for me a paradise in the sense. We have this, two extreme positions, Western, and sometimes we demonize Western approach, and we romanticize local approach. And I'm glad you brought this, that, the combination of two, it's probably a good way to go, right? But in our experience in World Vision, we have this program which we call Empowered Worldview. We go to the root cause, view of the world, which is basically built on the religious beliefs. we realize that in many African contexts and countries, the local perception of the African view of the world is so negative, is so influenced by Western NGOs and churches and all of this, to the point that they don't believe anymore in their own local ways and values. Did you find this in Sudan?
Okay, let's go. Who else? We'll go over there, there, and there. So I see three hands right now.
Hello, my name is James Alexander. I am with the State Department's Office of Religion and Global Affairs. And I would just have to say that as a returned Peace Corps volunteer working in South America back in the 1980s, that the engagement with religious officials was really important for what I was doing, working with water systems and that sort of development. And it was really powerful working, particularly with representatives of the Catholic Church on the ground, getting things done. It really gave you sort of a hand or a step up in terms of engaging the local communities because of the issue of trust. I have one question and then a real quick sort of comment, and that is, obviously you're taking on a model of world affairs that has existed for half a millennia. And what I see in watching this in practice, the ideas that would come out of this and thinking about it, is that we would have the Western diplomat having to learn to step back. It's really about organization and almost stepping out of the room when the conversation starts. Not quite, but it requires pulling themselves out of being at the forefront of the discussion. And so how does that happen in your thinking? And I'm just asking it generally for commentary, I guess. And then just quickly, I am new to my office, and part of my role is about education. And it's about bringing in, to have people speak to foreign service people, civil service people, and so on at the department. So, in fact, Ms. Kabawat and I are already discussing having her come in a month or so. So, I'm here, and if someone wants to come by and talk to me, please.
I'm Richard Parkins, also with the American Friends of the Episcopal Church of the Sudans. And in light of your comments, Bill, concerning the oral cultures that have to be respected in any kind of peacemaking process, what I understand has happened in South Sudan, and I've seen a bit of this, has been a proliferation of conflicts. So although it was a Nuer Dinka conflict, it has now taken shape in all parts of South Sudan, and there are about 64 tribes in South Sudan. So I guess my question is not to challenge the methodology of using the oral culture and fusing the techniques of Western peacemaking with that, but to recognize the complexity and the difficulty that now takes place because you have so many conflicts, you have multiple conflicts, and so therefore you have to have presumably multiple peacemaking initiatives that honor and respect each of these indigenous situations, and that just makes it a more challenging situation. And if I can just ask one more question, and that is, if you could just speak to the fact that you have a country now where half the population may be in varying states of food insecurity, the conflict continues, and so how do you create the safe space, or how do you address the challenge of safety and security while at the same time you're taking on this enormous and very difficult and delicate task of bringing warring tribes together? I know you have to do that, but if you would care to reflect on that, I think it would be a useful reflection. Thank you.
I'm Peter Kovac. I'm a rehired and UN at the Department of State, former head of the Office of International Religious Freedom, essentially doing the work that RGA does now before it was invented. I feel like Joyce's points about the training and the sensitivity of diplomats are so well taken. I've written on this. You've added to my breadth of understanding, and I thank you. Regarding the question I really have is, okay, in South Sudan, I believe our embassy is closed. We, am I right about that? No, it's still open. Okay. How many diplomats do we have on the ground?
We don't have an ambassador.
Okay, well, an ambassador is just the ambassador. How do you, I guess the question really is, when you have a really limited cadre on the ground, how, in a conflict, how do you best and how can we work together to engage the State Department, other foreign ministries that are involved in a peace building effort? That's the real question. I think, yeah, I mean, for instance, I'll give an example that involves Hind. Hind, when she was at USIP, on a contract with the Near East Bureau, put together with my office, I worked in the International Visitor Leadership Program, a Syrian interfaith group that met and with Hind's help in Professor Mark Gopin's shop at GMU actually worked out a resolution going forward. While I'm not sure what happened with that, it just shows me what we can do in a place where we don't have representation if there's good civil society, diplomatic cooperation. Thank you.
Did I miss any hands urgently? Okay, one last, and then I have a couple, and then we'll see what we do.
Thank you so much. I'll keep it brief. My name is Jessica Baumgartner-Zuzik, and I'm with Alliance for Peacebuilding. And I just had a quick question, slightly different from what I've been hearing today, but I'm interested in the fact that, Joyce, you brought up about some of the difficulties we face in terms of funding and support for how we strategically get our diplomacy and policy integrated within working with interfaith or religious peace builders. And an obstacle I'm not hearing that I'm personally interested in hearing you address a little bit is related around evidence and how we show support for the impact of why this can lend. I think all of us are convinced we know this because we do it and we're there, but how do we address the fact that so much of our evidence is based on anecdotal or qualitative work, and how do we better make the case for this so that we can continue to encourage this interaction?
Good. Okay, just to sort of put them on our agenda, I would be fascinated to hear more from Joyce about the process of nomination and selection of the Peacemakers. One element of it that I heard about and was involved in at some point was that you had very few women nominated, and that you actually designated one of the slots for women and then started to get more women nominees. But that clearly is a particular issue, the male domination. And I think it also plays into the perception of religion, that it's a very damaging perception that this is a male bastion. The other question I had, thinking both about South Sudan and Syria, is we're in fast-changing times, and in other conflicts we're seeing extraordinarily important roles of social media and texting, hate speech that's transmitted, which I don't think either of you have mentioned as a factor. Is it that these particular societies are much less involved with that, or is it happening and we haven't assessed it yet? So why don't we say we'll be out of here at 2 for sure. Anyone who has to leave can leave. And I'll leave it to you to decide which of these many fascinating questions you'll tackle.
Okay, because I have, not great short-term memory as I get older, I'm going to do the last 2. The nominations process, we seek nominations for people who meet the 5 criteria, and we reach out every couple of years for nominations of people who fill that. And what we discovered over time was that we were getting many nominations for men, few for women, that women were nominating men and men were nominating men. and that women would say, I'm not really doing peacemaking because I'm really not at risk. You know, I just got on a bus after a bombing in Israel and everybody was told to stay off the buses. But I had some peace work that had to happen in the north, so I did that. And I said, that's not a risk? And she's like, no, that's what I had to do. That's, that's nothing. Okay, so our board actually got involved and said that of every two peacemakers in action selected, one would be a woman. And we now select or seek to select every 2 years and we have also worked very hard to increase and expand the religious traditions from which we identify potential nominators and to expand globally who we are asking for nominations from. Because in addition to not getting women, we also weren't getting youth and we also weren't getting people and still get very few from the Eastern traditions. And I have theories on that, but that's another thing. So we work on that very hard to get large swath, and then we have a program advisory council of which David Little is a member, even though he was missing in action this year, and because he was overseas, um, and and they actually get an assessment from staff, but then they make their own assessment and choices, and we do not select them in-house. So that is the nominations process, and we are always looking, literally for the institutions, occasionally for the individuals who can make those recommendations. In terms of how you assess, first of all, qualitative information is a form of evaluation that should get credited, but it can be systematized. So as you go in, it is possible to ask questions, learn, take, and do a mapping and an assessment, and to go in later and assess those same issues and ask those same questions and get some qualitative information, even though you may not have a statistically relevant number of people. Other things, I think, go back to what I said, which I sadly think is true. I think that the religious peace builders with whom we work work spend their lives pursuing something that's what I call a vision of a lived peace, and that is bigger than lack of conflict. It includes, if you look at the SDGs at the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals, and you really think about what all of them are, if you put them all together and people have access to health and to jobs and to education and to peace and to equity, starts to look like a lived peace. And that's the vision that I find within the Peacemakers, each pursuing whichever piece is within their realm. And I don't see us achieving that fully forever, but working to identify it, get to it, sustain it for as long as we can, and then start again is really, I think, the cycles within which we work. And we can have more sustained peace and longer sustained peace if we do that. And that needs to be the goal. So I hope that answers a little bit. Do we want to turn to Hind or to Bill? Both. All right.
Why don't we have a last word from both of them? We have about 5 minutes.
Okay, Hind first. Hind. Any final words?
Mike.
Yes. Let's not take the religions. It's something like let's really emphasize that religion is so important in the time of conflict. And the more we have religious leaders or influential, this can help us a lot in solving problems. Last year, we put a Christian leader in one of that training, and he has so much influence in his positive way, in his loving way. So many Muslims from other areas, they were so attached to him, they were listening to his word of peace. So religious leaders, in my point of view, in Middle East, yes, it might be a problem for so many, but at the end of the day, they can be the solution, and we can emphasize on them so much and focus on them so they can help us in solving the conflict. Thank you.
Before I turn to the questions, just to let you know, out on the table as you leave, there's a two-pager on the action plan for peace with the South Sudan Council of Churches you could pick up. And I think there are two copies of an extensive report, like 16-page report, of what they have been involved in the last year. So those of you interested can take that. Let me just say one or two words for each different thing that I wrote down. Mitch, the answer is yes. that traditional people are marginalized in the midst of the conflict, oftentimes recruited into the conflict, and they also begin to develop a doubt of their own wisdom, and there is a need to revitalize that and gain new confidence. I know that in our people-to-people process, that was a core element of it, is to give place to traditional chiefs and to begin to help them to feel proud about what they've got that can work much better sometimes than other methods. But this is a real problem, a loss of confidence in the idea that Western is best. James, on the part about how do you do this dance? Do the diplomats have to step back, let the others do that? I think probably more important than diplomats learning about every religion where they might be, and they're constantly moved around, that they need to understand process skills and to realize the resources don't just come from track one diplomats. If they had those two things, so then in terms of process, there might be a process where part of it, the diplomats do step back and national, local people have a piece of the process. But they understand that's going to go then to another piece of it, which might be more Western in nature and might include such things as constitution writing, which is very complex piece. So I think if they realize their resources beyond their normal diplomatic scope in the religious community, the traditional community, then that will help in the design of a different style process. Richard, in terms of there are so many, this multiplication of conflicts. Tell you what happened about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I forget the time right now. But as the South Sudan Council of Churches is now taking these community conversations across the country. One was held in Yambio about 3 weeks ago. 200 people gathered for 3 days. Women's leaders, chiefs, youth leaders, church leaders, all were there. I think you raised the question about security. Who's going to provide security? It is a risky thing to hold that meeting in Yambio, where there's a lot of conflict outside the town. The rebels understood some kind of meeting was happening. They sent people in to check it out. They talked with them and they said, oh, the church leaders are leading this process and it's for peace. That's fine, go ahead. And they moved back into the bush. So even with the Woonlit conference, I did shuttle between Khartoum and South Sudan. We had to get Riek Machar to agree and Salva Kiir to agree, and John Garang actually wouldn't agree but had to be kind of marginalized from the powers at that point with that. But how you're going to create enough security that people can trust it is possible to do that. Right now, there have been 2 explosions in South Sudan in the last 4 years that have lowered trust below zero. So the opposition does not feel like there's any place in South Sudan they can be a part of negotiations. They don't trust the UN to make that security or the Regional Protection Force. That is a critical issue. Where can peace happen? This is where a Western method might have to take precedent over a traditional method. In the tradition, you would be in a mud hut and you would be staying for days. You would not have a 4-day meeting in a 5-star hotel in Addis. But it might be that it has to be out of the country, and this is part of the negotiation of the process and finding out what can they trust that will be secure enough that it can take place. And
We're coming to the witching hour, so just one more sentence.
Catherine, on social media and hate speech, we find there is a lot of hate speech, particularly among the diaspora, who are alienated from their home country, but they have taken a part of one side or another, and every rumor is passed on. And so one of the efforts made on the ground is to get in touch with the leaders in those communities. South Sudan Council of Churches is sending a high-level delegation here to Washington in 3 weeks. They will also be going to New York, meeting with the UN, and they are trying to plan meetings with key leaders in the diaspora to do that very effort of trying to tone down some of this kind of speech. But that is a critical issue.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. I promised you 2 o'clock, so let's make it 2. So first of all, I want to thank the teams who struggled with our beast of technology and were ultimately successful. So thank you, Hind, for your patience, and thank you to all of you. And above all, I want to thank Joyce and her colleagues for making this happen, for giving us a lot to think about and a lot of information. And I hope this is a conversation that continues.
Thank you.